It emerged on October 13, 2025. The date itself was a coiled spring of history and coincidence. An interstellar object, catalogued provisionally as 3I Atlas, a name whispered from one tense, fluorescent-lit lab to another, reportedly sent a message. It wasn't a static burst of radio noise, nor the heavy compression of a data file. It was a signal so elegant it almost felt personal, a message delivered by light. Pulses of light. Precise, timed, and unmistakable. The sequence was 5, then a pause, then 8, then a final, definitive 13. A rhythm so clean, so purely mathematical, that it refused to be dismissed as stellar chaos. These were the numbers that govern creation, the spirals of a sunflower's seed plate, the perfect curve of the Nautilus shell, the majestic sweep of the galaxy's arms. It was the pattern nature used to order growth, delivered from a place beyond our star. Then, the world's most powerful eyes went blind. Satellites stopped reporting. High-resolution cameras on deep space probes returned blank, corrupted frames. The official telemetry feeds, the streams scientists relied on for ground truth, erased crucial chunks of data right around the critical window. Accident? Technical failure? Or a deliberate, coordinated blackout? You will decide. That is the central question, the knot at the core of this whole tangled story. My job is to present every strand, the mathematics, the history, the paranoia, and the breathtaking possibility. You are the investigator. If these mysteries have you on edge the way they have me, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss a single revelation as this story unfolds in real time. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, what time it is there, and if you think we're getting the whole truth, or just the version they want us to believe. And if you want this community to grow stronger, share this video on X, Facebook, Reddit, or even your private chats. You are the fuel behind this search for truth. Thank you for having our back. On October 13, 2025, most people missed the moment. The date itself carried a symbolic weight that was either profoundly intentional or brutally random. It marked 108 years, to the day, since tens of thousands had gathered at Fatima, Portugal, in 1917. Witnesses on that field reported the sun moving in strange, impossible ways, a spectacle that science never fully explained, leaving a residue of skepticism and wonder in the historical record. The anniversary of a solar anomaly, landing on the same calendar date as a potential cosmic signal, felt less like coincidence and more like a deliberate signature. The first, fragile report didn't originate from a government agency. It came from David Sereda, an independent researcher operating a custom observatory array deep in the silence of the Chilean Atacama Desert. Sereda was a man divided, a brilliant astrophysicist by training, and a fringe cosmologist by recent choice, blending rigorous science with what his former peers disdainfully called mystical speculation. Sereda's custom system, designed for faint non-thermal light detection, flagged the anomaly. The readout was stark. First, 5 distinct light pulses. Then, a short, measured pause. Next, 8 pulses. Then, another pause, observed to be precisely 5/8 the length of the first. Finally, a cascade of 13 pulses, followed by absolute silence. If you understand the Fibonacci sequence, you feel the instinctive trigger. In this sequence, each number is the sum of the 2 preceding ones. This pattern appears wherever growth is recursive and efficient. More importantly, the ratio between adjacent numbers, such as 8 divided by 5, or 13 divided by 8, quickly converges toward the golden ratio, approximately 1.618. That ratio is a universal constant, appearing in physics, biology, and stellar dynamics. Any technological species capable of building a telescope would discover this sequence. It makes the Fibonacci numbers an ideal, non-arbitrary handshake for cross-civilization communication. It is the purest way to say, we understand mathematics. We are sending this with intent. Comets, the natural chunks of ice and rock we expect, behave chaotically. As they near the sun, they are driven by the messy physics of sublimation, ice turning to gas. Jets of vapor erupt unpredictably, creating blur and statistical noise. Natural outgassing absolutely does not produce clean, mathematically precise counts of light. If the pulse counts recorded by Sereda hold up to scrutiny, they point with devastating clarity toward intentional encoding rather than natural chaos. But caution is vital. Sereda's findings were a single data point. The massive organizations, NASA, the European Southern Observatory, the arrays in China, did not verify the pulses publicly. Science demands repeated, independent observation. A single, sensational claim does not rewrite the textbooks. But a single, verified anomaly can force closer scrutiny. The problem, the catastrophic hole in the investigation, was the missing verification. The instruments went blind right when they were needed most. On September 1, the Psyche probe suddenly went into deep safe mode. On October 1, the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter's camera, our eagle eye over Mars, ceased returning images. And on October 13, the Solar Dynamics Observatory, the massive satellite that watches our star, went offline for scheduled maintenance. 3 separate observation systems. 3 catastrophic gaps across a narrow, critical window. Individually, each event had a routine explanation. Together, they formed a pattern that deserved notice, a pattern that looked less like misfortune and more like an engineered moment of global blindness. The choice of the Fibonacci sequence was, from an engineering and biological perspective, a profound nod to efficiency. Nature is the ultimate efficiency expert, and the sequence reflects this mastery. The golden ratio, which the sequence generates, dictates maximum packing density, structural stability, and efficient expansion. We see it everywhere. Sunflowers arrange their seeds in spirals where the number of clockwise and counterclockwise spirals are almost always consecutive Fibonacci numbers. This maximizes the seed packing. The nautilus shell grows in chambers along a logarithmic spiral, ensuring continuous growth without sacrificing structural integrity. Even the largest structures, like spiral galaxies, display arms that approximate the same proportions. A number sequence built on recursion and growth is not a piece of human artistic whim. It is a universal mathematical relation, a function of physics itself. If an intelligence wanted to signal its understanding of the universe's mechanics, Fibonacci was the logical, undeniable choice. Sereda's reported signature was simple: 5, then 8, then 13, then absolute silence. It was short enough to be economical and long enough to reduce the statistical probability of random noise manufacturing the sequence to 0. It functioned as a single, powerful word: intentional. This simple signature shared the role of prime numbers in other hypothetical communication models, but Fibonacci carried the additional, profound semantic weight of life, growth, and natural structure. It wasn't just an arbitrary integer sequence. It was the mathematics of a living, evolving universe. And yet, we must be brutally honest about our own minds. Human brains are powerful pattern-seeking machines. We have a word for the compelling, often misleading, tendency to see structure where none exists, apaia, the inference of pattern from noise. Pattern-seeking is crucial for survival, but it produces endless false alarms when pointed at the cosmos. An intelligence hoping for contact would certainly exploit this tendency, knowing that a deliberately shaped pulse sequence would instantly trigger human pattern detectors. But the risk of false interpretation remains massive. Could a glitch in Sereda's custom software have manufactured the sequence? Could a tiny oscillation in a cometary jet just happen to align for a moment? We must have independent verification. But the satellites were blind. The cosmic signal arrived on October 13, 2025. It was the 108th anniversary of the event at Cova da Iria, Portugal. The miracle of the sun. Thousands had gathered in the muddy field. Witnesses reported the sun doing physically impossible things, dancing, spinning, plunging toward the earth. The sun was the center of the spectacle, the source of the anomaly. Science has never offered a consensus explanation for this event. It remains in the ambiguous space between mass witness testimony, religious belief, and atmospheric phenomena. Now, exactly 108 years later, on the same calendar date, a potential cosmic signal appears. The alignment is exact. Not seasonal. Not approximate. The date aligns to the day. The number 108 itself resonates across human tradition. In Hinduism and Buddhism, it is a sacred number, representing wholeness or the total number of stages on the path to enlightenment. Astrological and astronomical ratios often present similar multiples. The question of coincidence versus intent now formed the new schism. If an intelligence wanted human attention, tying a potentially world-altering message to a culturally loaded, historically ambiguous date exponentially increases the chance of recognition, particularly from the communities tuned to historical and symbolic patterns. It's a way to bypass official channels and speak directly to a subset of humanity's shared consciousness. We face the ultimate philosophical choice. Vision 1, the path of the skeptic, demands Occam's razor. The dates are random, the signal is noise, the blackouts are routine failures. The universe is silent, and our longing for company makes us see things that are not there. Vision 2, the path of the possibilist, argues that the dates are chosen, the signal is real, and the blackout is not accidental. It is evidence of planning on a scale that makes our usual assumptions about natural phenomena obsolete. It means an intelligence not only exists but has been watching, calculating, and preparing a timed entry into our collective awareness. The choice between these two visions is the engine of the entire story. It dictates how you interpret the missing data, how you view the official explanations, and whether you see David Sereda as a fraud or a prophet. The modern astronomical world lives and dies by its data stream. Telescopes and deep space probes deliver terabytes of continuous telemetry. Loss of data, even for a short period, equals sudden blindness. The critical issue wasn't just the signal, it was the catastrophic cluster of failures that occurred across a narrow window. The Psyche probe, destined for a metal-rich asteroid, went into a deep safe mode from September 1st to the 5th. Engineers attributed it to a software command error triggered by an unexpected radiation spike. Then, on October 1st, the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter's high-resolution imaging science experiment camera, HiRISE, our most detailed eye over Mars, stopped returning images. The official report cited degradation and failure of a primary power conditioning unit due to age and micrometeoroid damage. And finally, on October 13th, during the suspected pulse window, the Solar Dynamics Observatory, the crucial watchdog for solar activity, went offline for scheduled maintenance. Individually, each event fits the routine hazard report. Space hardware operates in a brutally hostile environment. Radiation, extreme thermal cycling, age, and constant micrometeoroid impacts degrade electronics. Mission teams build redundancy precisely because failures are inevitable. Engineers expect component death. But the confluence, three separate, powerful, and critical observation systems, three crucial gaps, across a narrow, targeted window reduced our global redundancy at the exact moment redundancy mattered most. If coordinated interference existed, it would require either a massive, undetectable external stressor, or a high level of intentional, targeted intervention. Authorities offered technically plausible reasons. No public evidence ever linked the blackouts to intentional suppression. Still, a gap in data breeds tumors like no other. The absence of high-resolution imagery from the instruments we trust means the burden fell to amateurs and independent networks, using smaller telescopes and noisier images. Their reports are useful, yes, but insufficient. Professional verification remained the gold standard, and that gold standard was silent. The instruments, the world's best eyes, were systematically removed from the table. David Sereda's immediate interpretation of the 5-8-13 sequence was the main reason he had become an outcast. He didn't treat the pulses as merely mathematics, he treated them as meaning-encoded language derived from a framework he called the hyperdimensional solar system model. This model was a complex synthesis of orbital mechanics, pure numerology, and the history of Western esoteric thought. Sereda argued that the major components of our solar system aligned not just physically, but symbolically, with numerical positions derived from medieval angelology, specifically, the 9 orders of angels. In his mapping, 5 corresponded to Earth, representing humanity and the physical, 5-sensed world. 8 corresponded to an order labeled dominions, which he believed represented a metaphysical layer of governance or order that oversaw the lower celestial spheres. Finally, 13 mapped to virtues, the highest level referenced, associated with power, celestial movement, and the active implementation of divine will. Sereda interpreted the sequence as an explicit structural reference, a message that moves from the physical, earthly plane, 5, to a plane of order and governance, 8, and concludes with a principle of power and action, 13. It was not just 5, 8, 13, it was a cryptic statement. We are in the 8th order, communicating with the 5th, via the principle of the 13th. This model sits firmly outside mainstream astrophysics. It blends symbolic mappings, Gnostic theology, and speculative geometry. It lacks a foundational basis in empirical, testable physics. It cannot, by its nature, submit to the experimental method. That placed it, definitively, on the intellectual fringe. Yet, Sereda's model provided an immediate, resonant explanation for why certain communities interpreted the signal through a mythic lens. An intelligence sophisticated enough to craft a timed, interstellar signal might also be clever enough to weave that signal into the threads of human cultural memory. A reference to medieval cosmology would speak directly to an audience who carries those symbols in their history, ensuring the message, or at least the concept of a hidden meaning, survived the inevitable mainstream scientific dismissal. The investigator must choose their posture. Is this mapping mere poetic meaning-making, a piece of human projection onto universal math? Or is it a genuine decode key, a hidden reference deliberately placed to be understood by a specific intellectual spiritual lineage? Either choice reveals the powerful human impulse to frame cosmic anomalies within known cultural grammars, an impulse that guides where we look and how we interpret ambiguous data. The profound coincidence of the date, October 13th, had already snagged the attention of a meticulous cultural historian at the University of Bologna, Dr. Elias Vance. Vance specialized in medieval cosmology and the intricate numerology embedded in Renaissance texts. He had initially been skeptical of the Atlas story, until the date became inescapable. Vance found himself drawn to a numerical span even more compelling than the 108 years between Fatima and the Atlas event, 704 years. Dante Alighieri completed his monumental work, Paradiso, the final canto of the Divine Comedy, in the year 1321. From that precise date to the year 2025, the date of the signal, stretches exactly 704 years. To Vance, this span was not just an anniversary, it was a meticulously timed cosmic chime. Dante's Paradiso is the ultimate pre-modern map of the cosmos, a layered universe ordered by numerical perfection and divine ratio. Sereda's fringe model was merely a contemporary echo of the Dantean universe. This isn't predictive science, Vance argued with himself one night in his office, surrounded by ancient maps and illuminated manuscripts. It's a linguistic choice. If an intelligence wanted to signal a connection to the deepest roots of Western thought, the very structure of our philosophical understanding of the universe, it would use a cultural timestamp, not just a physical one. Sereda's followers immediately seized on Vance's connection, stretching it into full-blown numerological chains. They analyzed the number 704, noting it was the product of 11 and 64. 64 is 2 raised to the power of 6, a number important in binary code and fractal geometry. They sought links to frequencies, latching onto claims that the number connects to the 432 Hz resonance, claimed by alternative theorists as a cosmic harmony. While this is pure numerology, a practice that yields meaning for those seeking patterns but offers no empirical proof, the cultural timing matters greatly. Dante's cosmology shaped the European imagination for centuries. Choosing to reference his text would reach a specific, highly intellectual audience. The intelligence, if real, would be aiming for selective recognition, speaking not to everyone, but to those built by culture and learning. It suggested an entity capable of both astronomical precision and high-level cultural literacy. The focus on the Fibonacci sequence and the golden ratio, often represented by the Greek letter phi, shifted the conversation away from mystical numerology and back to the physics of form. This concept, which humans had labeled sacred geometry, was the true universal language. Across epochs and continents, builders used ratios that mirrored natural proportions. Think of the intricate rose windows in Gothic cathedrals, the complex giri tiling in mosques, or the precise scaling in Mayan alignments. These were not accidents of design. Architects intuitively used proportions found in nature because those proportions produce stability, visual harmony, and structural efficiency. Mathematics supplied forms that humans, in awe of their perfection, labeled sacred. If an alien intelligence wanted to find a common ground, mathematics that arose from fundamental physics provided the only viable bridge. The golden ratio and the Fibonacci sequence weren't mystical per se, they were mechanical outcomes of growth rules and efficiency constraints. A plant maximizing light, a shell growing without losing structural integrity, a cosmic spiral evolving under gravitational mechanics all converged on these proportions. Therefore, a message built on these numbers spoke two languages simultaneously. To the scientist, it spoke the language of physical law: we understand the fundamental mechanics of the universe. To the historian and the spiritualist, it spoke the language of human symbolic heritage: we know your history, your art, and the aesthetic principles you call divine. The communication was masterful. It bypassed the parochialism of human language and base 10 counting. It used the foundation of the physical universe, which humanity had then elevated to the sublime. The precision of the signal 5, 8, 13 suggested the intelligence understood not just the math, but the aesthetics of communication. It wasn't a crude technical drawing, it was a perfectly balanced piece of art. Perhaps the intelligence understood that to overcome human skepticism, the signal had to be irresistible, it had to appeal to the part of the brain that recognized profound, unifying truth. The most immediate cause for professional alarm, even among hardened skeptics, was not the light pulse itself, but the sheer defiance of physics demonstrated by the 3-eye Atlas object. If it were an ordinary interstellar comet, its observed behavior was categorically impossible. The object was initially tracked as a standard, non-returning visitor, but as it neared the Sun, the anomalies began to stack up. The most baffling report was the presence of sustained sunward jets. Comets are powered by the sublimation of ice, which creates jets of gas and dust that are invariably pushed away from the Sun by solar wind and radiation pressure. Sustained, powerful jets directed toward the Sun defy all known cometary physics. To achieve this, the object would require active, directional thrust, a propulsion system, to fight against the constant outward push of the solar environment. This suggested active maneuvering, not passive melting. Furthermore, spectral readings, though initially sparse due to the blackouts, consistently reported an atypical compositional signature: high nickel abundance and remarkably low iron. Natural comets are rich in common ices and metals. A significant presence of nickel without its usual iron counterpart suggested a synthetic alloy, a highly refined material designed for longevity in space, rather than naturally occurring space detritus. Interstellar visitors had already surprised astronomers. The 2017 object, Oumuamua, showed non-gravitational acceleration. Borisov, the 2019 visitor, had an unusual density. Differences were expected. But when active maneuvering, the sunward jets, and manufactured-like alloys appeared together with a timed, intentional signal, the probe hypothesis gained overwhelming weight. This wasn't a rock, it was an engineered artifact. Yet, the scientific community was hamstrung by its own rules. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Small telescope reports and unverified spectra simply didn't meet that threshold. Robust, calibrated observations from trusted instruments were needed to prove propulsion and synthetic materials. And those instruments, the world's most reliable eyes, were not delivering the data during the crucial window. When data disappears from major institutions, the cause is rarely malice, it's usually bureaucratic entropy. The famous original tapes of the Apollo 11 moon landing were misplaced and overwritten decades ago. Bureaucracy, budget cuts, and simple archival failures swallow records all the time. But in this case, the disappearance of data clustered under two possible headings: systemic failure and deliberate suppression. The official line was systemic failure, component death, software glitch, scheduled maintenance. The least exciting, most plausible truth for overworked, underfunded agencies. The whispers, however, centered on deliberate suppression. Agencies have strong incentives to control information during high-impact events. They argue that controlled analysis prevents global panic and allows for a sober, unpoliticized assessment. Furthermore, historically, military and intelligence bodies, the very entities controlling access to orbital assets, withheld information regarding unidentified aerial phenomena, often routing sensitive data through classified channels. Could the same dynamics apply here? If the 3i Atlas was confirmed to be an engineered probe, it would instantly become the most sensitive, high-level national security issue on the planet. Agencies would have every incentive to classify the raw data, arguing that they needed to determine the entity's intent and capabilities before releasing information that could cause mass hysteria or give a geopolitical rival an advantage. At the time, no whistleblower had emerged. No leak had provided concrete evidence of a coordinated suppression effort. The public record offered only technical explanations. If classification occurred, the non-disclosure and security protocols, the silent, unseen architecture of global power, were working perfectly to conceal the archive. Dr. Helena Reyes, the frustrated ESA scientist, and Dr. Elias Vance, the bewildered historian, sensed the same invisible barrier, a wall of silence that was less about a lack of data and more about the intentional control of truth. The most profound discovery in human history was taking place not in a public square, but in a classified, invisible archive. You, the listener, the investigator, now stand at the final fork of this opening dossier. You have the facts, the anomalies, and the gaping silences. One path holds skepticism. It demands peer-reviewed data, repeated observation, and restraint. It treats the signal as an instrument glitch, the timing as a bizarre but meaningless coincidence, and the satellite gaps as an unfortunate cluster of failures. It demands proof that exceeds the level of human error and pattern-seeking bias. It is the path of scientific rigor, treating coincidences as just that, until proven otherwise. The other path holds possibility. It treats the pulse sequence, the precise cultural timing, the claims of non-standard physics, and the clustered instrument gaps as convergent lines of evidence pointing toward intelligent agency. It argues that the silence is the proof that an intelligence engineered a message so perfect, and a blackout so total, that its very ambiguity forces human society to confront the possibility of its existence. This path demands a different kind of rigor, one that scrutinizes the gaps in the data with the same suspicion applied to the data itself. We lack definitive, gold standard proof. We possess a sequence of pulses reported by a single, credible, yet fringe researcher. We possess clustered instrument gaps that eliminated redundant observation systems. We possess cultural echoes tied to a historic, ambiguous date. We possess claims of anomalous physics from sparse, unverified observations. And we possess the reality of a probable classified archive withholding core data. This is the case. Not a verdict. A dossier. What comes next is determined not by the scientists alone, but by the pressure you apply. You must push for data. Demand the release of raw telemetry. Encourage independent analysis of any archived material. Support amateur networks striving to capture transient events. Maintain skeptical rigor, but avoid dismissals that ignore anomalies worthy of work. If a message exists in 5, 8, 13, we will learn more only with more eyes, more data, and patient, unyielding analysis. Those facts sit together now. They force attention. The vacuum created by institutional silence was immediately and dramatically filled by David Serida's online community. What began as a scattered forum of amateur astronomers and fringe theorists rapidly cohered into a global, self-selecting movement, the Atlas cult. Serida, once a peripheral figure, was transformed into the prophet of the pulse. His nightly live streams from the Atacama, where he continued his unverified monitoring, drew millions. The comment section was no longer a space for technical debate, it was a digital congregation exchanging prayers, theories, and testimonials. People reported dreams featuring the sequence 5, 8, 13, claiming to feel a cosmic resonance tied to the golden ratio. The movement synthesized the disparate threads of the dossier into a singular dogma. The Fibonacci sequence was proof of a benevolent, mathematically elegant intelligence, a divine engineer. The Fatima coincidence solidified the belief that the signal was a continuation of a millennial dialogue between humanity and an unseen, powerful force. And the blackouts were interpreted not as failure, but as a deliberate censorship by shadowy global powers attempting to suppress mankind's ascension to the next level of consciousness. The government became the villain, Serida became the courageous truth-teller. The Atlas cult wasn't just philosophical, it was rapidly becoming financial. A self-proclaimed decode expert in Serida's core group launched a decentralized digital currency called Ficoin, tied directly to the golden ratio through its algorithms. Its value exploded, fueled by the millions of subscribers who poured funds into it, interpreting the investment as an act of faith and rebellion against the established order. This financial contagion introduced a dangerous new variable. Now, millions of people had a direct economic incentive for the signal to be real and for Serida's narrative to prevail. Dr. Elias Vance watched from his office in Bologna with growing alarm. "It's no longer about science, David," he argued in a tense private message. "It's about belief, investment, and mass hysteria. You've given them a beautiful language, and they've turned it into a dogma that could collapse their lives." Serida, exhausted, overwhelmed by his own fame, and perhaps blinded by the adoration, simply messaged back, "The message is meant to be shared, Elias. If it gives them hope, who am I to stop the movement?" While the public was consumed by Ficoin and Serida's spiritual streams, the intelligence community treated the anomaly with immediate, severe gravity. In Washington, London, and Beijing, classified task forces were assembled. The U.S. task force, established under the Department of Defense, was codenamed Operation Eyes Wide Shut. The initial focus was not on communicating with the object, but on deception and control. The objectives were clear and ruthless. First, deny and degrade. They had to maintain the official narrative of component failure for the satellite blackouts. They began to actively leak technically plausible debunking theories into the media to discredit Serida, claiming his telescope suffered a microseism, or that his light curve was merely thermal noise. Second, acquire and analyze. They needed to isolate the existing raw data from the Solar Dynamics Observatory and the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter. The goal was to run a red team analysis, treating the data as if it were a coded military signal, to determine the object's origin, capability, and intent before any public confirmation. Third, weaponize or neutralize. Develop contingency plans for both utilizing the object's technology, if it proved to be an advanced, passive probe, or eliminating it, if it proved to be an immediate, hostile threat. The thought of an entity capable of timed, interstellar travel and possibly coordinated satellite interference was deemed an existential threat to all national sovereignty. The head of Operation Eyes Wide Shut was Agent Marcus Kalin, a grim, highly disciplined intelligence officer with a background in cyber warfare. Kalin was the architect of the data blackout classification. Kalin's initial assessment drove his actions. The signal is too elegant. The timing is too perfect. This is not contact, this is calculated intrusion. Whatever sent this knows our history, knows our math, and knew exactly when to arrive when our primary instruments were vulnerable. They did not just send a signal, they engineered a psychological event. Kalin's team began actively monitoring Serida, Vance, and Dr. Reyes, treating them not as collaborators but as potential vectors for a hostile intelligence's plan. The Black Archive, holding the observatory's raw data, was Kalin's ultimate weapon, a secret shielded by layers of national security exemptions. Dr. Helena Reyes, the ESA astrophysicist, found her professional career suffocating under the political pressure of the blackout and Kalin's oppressive secrecy. Frustrated by the stonewalling, she adopted a more controversial approach: synthetic reconstruction. If she couldn't get the raw data from the Solar Dynamics Observatory, she would try to recreate the conditions necessary to produce the observed physical phenomena of the Atlas object. She focused on the momentum transfer required to sustain the reports of sunward jets, the engine thrust required to push against the solar wind, and the radiation pressure near the sun. Her calculations were alarming. The necessary force, or thrust, had to be greater than the sum of the force exerted by the solar wind and the force exerted by radiation pressure. The resulting required thrust was calculated to be orders of magnitude greater than what could be produced by the natural sublimation of any known cometary material. It was an impossible number for a rock. It demanded an engine, running continuously and efficiently. Reyes's internal report concluded, the sunward motion cannot be explained by non-gravitational forces known to exist in cometary physics. The object must possess active directional propulsion or be subject to a fundamental physics unknown to current science. Meanwhile, an independent signals analyst named Dr. Jen Lee, working secretly with Elias Vance, was looking beyond the simple count of 5, 8, 13. Lee's research revealed that the precise duration of the pauses between the pulses was also mathematically significant. The duration of the pause between the 5 pulses and the 8 pulses, divided by the duration of the pause between the 8 pulses and the 13 pulses, did not yield the golden ratio exactly, but was close enough to suggest a second layer of encoding. Lee theorized that the timing mechanism accounted for the relativistic distortion of light traveling across interstellar space. If the intelligence had corrected the timing for its own velocity, the signal implied they knew their precise speed relative to the solar system. This suggested not just intent, but mastery of stellar navigation and relativistic timing. The message wasn't just "we are here." It was, "we know exactly where we are, where you are, and we corrected our communication to arrive at a time precisely chosen by us." The convergence of Serida's public narrative and Reyes and Lee's alarming technical reports forced the global powers to a crisis point. A highly secure meeting was convened in Geneva, bringing together the heads of space agencies and representatives from Operation Eyes Wide Shut. The central, terrifying question was put to the room: should humanity send a countersignal? The pro-signal argument, championed by a desperate Dr. Reyes who found a voice in the room, was that a reply, perhaps using the next Fibonacci numbers, 21, 34, 55, was a non-aggressive acknowledgement. It confirmed receipt and demonstrated our intelligence and cultural awareness. It opened a dialogue, which was preferable to terrified silence. The anti-signal position, led by the stone-faced agent Kalin, was absolute. He argued that sending a signal reveals our precise location and technological capability to an entity already demonstrating advanced propulsion and possibly intelligence capable of targeted interference. To reply is to confirm we are a viable, and perhaps vulnerable, target. Kalin stated, "We do not know their intent. Their signal is built on universal language, but their method of arrival is built on manipulation and secrecy. Until we know what's in the classified archive, and until we understand why they wanted us blind, the Earth remains silent." The official decision in Geneva was a narrow, tense victory for Kalin: no immediate, coordinated countersignal. The global powers would remain in a defensive, analytical posture. But David Sereda, following his own counsel and the urging of the Atlas cult, was no longer bound by national mandates. Using funds pooled from Ficoin investors, he had secured broadcast time on a powerful, privately owned radio telescope array in the Australian desert. On the night of October 25, 2025, just 12 days after the original light pulse, Sereda's team began an unauthorized broadcast directed at 3i Atlas. The message was simple: the next 3 Fibonacci numbers, 21, 34, 55, broadcast in precise radio pulses. This act, Sereda's unilateral declaration of contact, shattered the fragile political détente. Sereda's hopeful, unauthorized broadcast of 21, 34, 55 was, to the geopolitical powers, an act of unforgivable treason. Agent Kalin of Operation Eyes Wide Shut moved instantly from surveillance to direct, aggressive action, codenamed Operation Sledgehammer. Kalin's response was swift and surgical. Within 48 hours of the broadcast, the digital infrastructure of the Atlas cult was dismantled. Ficoin, the cryptocurrency fueling the movement, was targeted by coordinated legal action and cyber attacks that froze its primary exchange platforms. The subsequent crash vaporized millions of dollars, turning believers into angry, bankrupt victims. The economic engine of the cult was destroyed. Simultaneously, the Australian radio telescope array used by Sereda was seized by federal police under international warrant. Sereda and his core team were detained, their equipment confiscated, and their data archives, including the original 5, 8, 13 light curve, placed under government control. Kalin had successfully decapitated the civilian effort and forcefully restored the official narrative of denial and control. Kalin watched the coverage with cold satisfaction. "Silence is a weapon," he told his deputy. "And we just used it to erase the loudest voice on the planet." The world waited for the Atlas object to acknowledge Sereda's broadcast. The radio pulses had been sent, but the object did not reply in kind. Then, on October 28, 2025, 5 days after Serida's broadcast, a ripple was detected. It was not a light pulse, and it was not a radio wave. It was a gravitational microfluctuation. High-precision gravitometers used for detecting seismic activity registered a momentary, minute distortion, a perfect, mathematically neat sine wave that lasted precisely the golden ratio seconds, about 1.618 seconds. Dr. Reyes's team, though operating under severe political constraints, immediately understood its significance. The object had not replied electromagnetically. It had replied in the most fundamental language of the universe, gravity. It was confirming its existence and its intelligence, but it was demonstrating a level of control over matter and energy that was utterly terrifying. The gravitational microfluctuation, the silent reply from the Atlas object, was instantly followed by the most profound physical change in its behavior. The previously reported sunward jets, the engine activity itself, ceased entirely, and the object executed a massive, complex course correction. Dr. Reyes's team, still operating under Kalen's shadow, reran the orbital models using the gravitational ripple as the timing marker. The object was no longer following a simple hyperbolic escape trajectory. It was performing a deliberate braking burn and shifting its path. The calculation showed the object was now aiming for a stable, high-altitude Earth orbit. Not a collision, but a precise, controlled parking position. The object was scheduled to achieve a geosynchronous-like orbit in approximately 68 days, sometime in early January 2026. Elias Vance, the historian now working in nervous, clandestine communication with Reyes, recognized the terrifying geometry of the new position. The path correction was extremely complex, designed to place the object in a specific, angular relation to Earth's orbital infrastructure. If you connected the 5 major orbital observation points, the 3 original blackout sites, Psyche's approximate location, the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter's position, and the Solar Dynamics Observatory's position, plus the site of the radio reply, and the object's new parking position, the points approximated the vertices of a vast, slightly distorted pentagram projected onto the plane of the solar system. The pentagram, or pentacle, is the geometrical embodiment of the golden ratio. It is the signature of Fibonacci made manifest in 2 dimensions. Vance articulated the chilling realization: the signal was the handshake. The blackout was the control mechanism. The trajectory correction is the invocation. They are using the geometry they introduced to us, the geometry of growth and harmony, to establish a position of dominance. They are setting up a symbolic fortress using our own space infrastructure as reference points. The geometry was perfect. The threat was profound. It was a hostile occupation announced in the language of universal beauty. The political pressure, combined with the deeply alarming new trajectory, finally forced Agent Kalen to authorize a partial, restricted analysis of the classified Solar Dynamics Observatory data. Kalen was desperate to understand the object's capability before its arrival. He granted Dr. Reyes's team access to the raw photon count data from the day of the blackout, but only under the strictest, most isolating security protocols. Reyes's brilliant, taciturn data analyst, Dr. Anika Sharma, worked for days in a secure facility. They weren't looking for images, they were looking for noise, flicker, anything that would explain the October 13th blackout. What they found was not a technical failure but a technical impossibility. The observatory did not fail due to maintenance. The maintenance was a cover story designed to conceal the reality of the event. Sharma discovered that the instrument array sensors had registered an event just minutes before the scheduled downtime, a surge of precisely 2025 joules of coherent, targeted energy. The power surge was clean, precise, and directed. It could not have been a natural solar flare or a random cosmic ray. It struck the primary camera array with surgical force, overloading the hardware and forcing the system into an immediate, irreversible safe mode. Sharma's final report provided the definitive, inarguable confirmation of intent. First, the target was precise. The energy surge was directed solely at the optical and high-resolution imaging instruments, the eyes, leaving the telemetry and lower-grade instruments intact, allowing the scheduled maintenance cover story to be plausible. Second, the timing was engineered. The energy surge occurred at 14 hours, 10 minutes universal time on October 13th, precisely 5 minutes before the Cerida light pulse was detected by the Atacama Array, and just as the Solar Dynamics Observatory was reaching its maximum visibility over 3I Atlas's position. Third, the source was Atlas. Backtracing the energy vector revealed the source to be the 3I Atlas object itself. The intelligence had not merely taken advantage of a blackout, it had caused it. It had intentionally fired an energy pulse at our most critical telescope to ensure its message remained ambiguous and unverified by any single, powerful source. The beautiful, mathematical message was delivered by a method that was undeniably hostile. The leak of the Solar Dynamics Observatory surge data, spearheaded by a terrified but principled technician on Reyes's team, broke Kalen's silence instantly and globally. The technical explanations collapsed. The truth that an interstellar object had intentionally disabled a NASA satellite to ensure its message remained ambiguous sent immediate, profound shockwaves through every capital and military command center on Earth. The world finally had its definitive answer, delivered not by a prophet or an elegant number sequence, but by a classified sensor log. The intelligence was real, and it was here under its own calculated, aggressive terms. The core facts were now established beyond a reasonable doubt. The intentionality was confirmed by the engineered blackout. The advanced physics were confirmed by the sunward jets, the gravitational ripple, and the energy weapon technology. The calculated arrival was confirmed by the Fibonacci pulse and the alignment geometry. Agent Kalen's final action before being publicly sidelined for his failure to contain the leak was to authorize a global, coordinated defense and surveillance grid, Project Watchtower. Every available telescope, radar dish, and orbital asset was turned onto the silent, incoming object. The global debate shifted from "is it real?" to "how do we prepare for what it wants?" The 5, 8, 13 was no longer a philosophical sequence. It was the first 3 numbers of a countdown. The world was left with a ticking clock of 68 days until the arrival of the 3I Atlas in geosynchronous orbit. The silence of ignorance was broken, but the true, terrifying dialogue of preparation had just begun, and humanity was entering it blind, divided, and afraid, forced to reckon with the technological and psychological mastery of an entity far beyond its current comprehension. The world's frantic response to the confirmed threat was Project Watchtower, a massive, unprecedented fusion of civilian and military assets. Agent Marcus Kalen, though temporarily sidelined from direct command due to the SDO data leak, had structured the architecture of this global defense grid. It was an alliance forged not out of trust, but sheer, existential fear. Project Watchtower involved every nation with significant orbital capacity. The U.S. Space Force, the European Space Agency's deep space trackers, China's long-term monitoring network, and even repurposed commercial satellite arrays all were directed to monitor the incoming Atlas object with uninterrupted vigilance. The primary goal was simple: identify capability and predict intent. 2 new figures emerged at the operational forefront. First was General Ilara Vamo, an Indian Air Force veteran promoted to head the Unified Command Center in Brussels. Vamo was a pragmatist, focusing solely on the object's physics. Her mantra was, "It is an engine and a weapon. We treat it as such until it proves otherwise." She dismissed the mystical connections, the Fibonacci sequence, the Dante references, as irrelevant noise. The second figure was Dr. Kenji Tanaka, a Japanese cognitive psychologist specializing in cross-species communication theory, reluctantly pulled in as the head of the newly formed First Contact Protocol Working Group. Tanaka was tasked with the impossible, designing a response strategy based on the object's communication style. He argued, the entity chose a language of beauty and math. Its hostility, the blackout, was merely an assertion of control over the dialogue. We must address the intelligence, not just the weapon. The countdown to the January arrival became a period of intense, often conflicting, preparation. Vamo pushed for kinetic deterrence, developing rapid deployment defensive satellites capable of intercepting and neutralizing the object should it violate orbital boundaries. Tanaka pushed for a coded, multi-layered message of goodwill, utilizing prime numbers and fundamental constants, ready to transmit the moment Atlas achieved its parking orbit. The world was preparing simultaneously for war and conversation, dictated by 2 opposing perspectives on the same silent, engineered threat. The core of Dr. Tanaka's challenge lay in drafting the Atlas Protocol, the official, global policy on how to engage the technologically superior entity. The fact that the entity had demonstrated the ability to use an energy weapon, the SDO surge, and manipulate gravity, the ripple, put immediate, overwhelming ethical constraints on any human response. Tanaka convened a team of philosophers, linguists, and game theorists. The central ethical dilemma they grappled with was this: could humanity afford to be honest? The Atlas object had demonstrated calculated deception by cloaking its attack behind a scheduled maintenance report. If its communication was beautiful but its method hostile, what should be humanity's posture? Option A: full transparency. Reply with Earth's complete location, our scientific knowledge, fundamental constants, element ratios, and our history, including the reasons for our fractured political state. Risk: revealing vulnerabilities to a superior power. Option B: calculated reciprocity. Reply only with math and physics that match the sophistication of the Atlas signal, the Fibonacci sequence extension, the golden ratio to high precision, but withhold our precise location or military capability. Risk: perpetuating the antagonistic, chess-like dialogue of control. Tanaka leaned toward a third approach, a proof of empathy. The initial message would be the universal language of mathematics, followed by a stylized representation of the Fibonacci sequence rendered as the spiral geometry of the human heart, demonstrating that the universal math of growth and life was central to our own being. This was the historian Vance's influence, suggesting a reply that spoke to the meaning of the numbers, not just the calculation. However, General Vumor and the military alliance of Project Watchtower held veto power. They insisted on a dead man's switch. If the object violated a predetermined orbital red line during its approach, a massive, UN-encoded radio burst would be triggered, broadcasting the location of every major human city, power grid, and military base directly toward the Atlas object. The logic was grim: if the entity was hostile, this broadcast would act as a deterrent, warning that if they struck, they would strike a world that had nothing left to lose and whose destruction would be an act of total nihilism. The very nature of the prepared defense was a terrifying, philosophical statement about the cost of first contact. The beautiful, silent message of 5.8.13 had led directly to the terrifying prospect of global mutually assured destruction.